And listen, this is the missing link. For 20 years, this thing has been grinding, but the missing link is Burke.
For the past couple of episodes, we've been dealing with Burke Ramsey. We've been focusing on JonBenet's older brother. And we are looking at 6 insights from Burke's 6-hour interrogation. We've dealt with the first 3, and in this analysis, we'll deal with the remaining 3.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. As I mentioned earlier, in this analysis we'll complete our study of the 6 insights we get from Burke Ramsey's interrogation. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Now, some people have mentioned that when it comes to the Ramsey case, if you want to get real good insights, then you really do want to follow this channel. If you're with me, your insight level is there. Without me, here.
With me, it's here. Without me, here. With me, without me. With me, without me.
If you're finding this particular analysis worthwhile, please hit the thanks button and let's get started. So, number 4, it's the 3 remaining insights from Burke's 6-hour interrogation. Number 4 is, what gift did Burke play with before he went to bed? So, hours before JonBenet died, what was Burke doing? What gift was he playing with? Now, what I'd like to do, just to test your knowledge, test your insight of this case, test your understanding, is to write down right now what gift you think Burke Ramsey was playing with. And if you think it's an irrelevant question, you can write that down as well.
Yeah.
Did you get what you had asked for that year?
Nintendo 64.
And what did JonBenet get?
I think she got a big dollhouse. We both got bikes.
And you'll see that the Nintendo 64 is something that comes up in the narrative, that one of the first thing Burke did on the morning after Christmas, with everything going on, is he grabbed his Nintendo 64 and then he went with Fleet White out the house. So you can tell that that was a priority regardless even of what had happened to JonBenet. Now, the other thing that I think we need to talk about at some stage is, what gift was JonBenet either excited about or preoccupied about? Now, we heard that she got a dollhouse. Maybe it's time that we spoke about the dolls that JonBenet got. Now, one detail that stands out is that Burke didn't seem to want to go to bed on the night JonBenet was killed. This is Christmas night. Now, not only is he up late playing with a toy, and what better night to stay up late playing with a toy than Christmas night? It's a brand new toy, and what else is a child excited about Christmas? Getting up early to begin the process of seeing what you got for Christmas. And there's also this impression that Burke was so excited about Christmas that, well, who went downstairs into the wine cellar and tore open the wrapped gift that was down there, a gift that was ostensibly for him? So you kind of get the sense that this 9-year-old boy was very big into presents, and who wasn't at that age? And so it is possible that he was up late drinking tea and eating pineapple. Not just that, but also playing with a toy. Not just playing with a toy, but also eating and drinking something. Now, you would think if JonBenet was there and if Burke was innocent in her death, then that would be, could be, might be, certainly hypothetically, the last moment he spent with JonBenet before she died. And if so, that he'd remember it. Now, what is also really interesting with that article, and I didn't mention it in the previous analysis, that's from the Daily Mail. Phil Miller, a Boulder County Assistant District Attorney who handles the officer's juvenile cases, said that while children have trouble reconstructing past events, this is so important, the notable exception for children is recalling traumatic events. And he said these are strongly etched in a child's memory. But what about the events leading up to JonBenet's death and on the other side of that? From Steve Thomas's book, page 317, he writes, referring to this interview with Dan Schiller, with Burke's legs pulled up and his chin on his knees, Burke said that he played some Nintendo 64 on the afternoon of December 25th. So what do we have? On December 25th, he's playing with a Nintendo 64. That was the gift that he asked for. That was the gift that he got. What is the first thing that he does when he leaves the house? He takes along the Nintendo 64. Nothing else as far as we know. And so then the question is, what toy was he playing with on the night, late at night, on the Christmas night? Now, in John's version of events, he says that his son was assembling a toy, putting together a toy, but I wonder whether he wasn't playing with a Nintendo 64. Something else I meant to point out is when Dr. Phil discusses this whole thing, he seems to imply that when the family went to bed that night, there was no bowl of pineapple out there, and that it was suddenly there the next morning, which kind of implies that an intruder brought the bowl, or it implies that something happened without John and Patsy's knowledge of it, which is quite strange because you actually have a bowl with Burke Ramsey's fingerprints on it, allegedly, and also Patsy Ramsey's fingerprints on it. And that seems to suggest, well, didn't they know about the bowl being there? And so when showed a photograph of the pineapple and bowl, this is by Dan Schiller, Burke recognized the bowl. He didn't say, wow, I think someone must have brought that in the house. It's not one of our bowls. And so that showed it belonged in the house and was not brought in by an intruder. And wouldn't that be absurd, the intruder coming in through the basement window with a bowl of pineapple and milk and a spoon in his hands? And so have a look at this image from the Boy's Life magazine from December 1996. This wasn't very easy to get hold of, but they had a feature specifically highlighting these games that were coming out, including the Nintendo 64. So the part I want to emphasize is the toy of the month, the toy of the moment for Burke was the Nintendo 64. These toys were selling like hotcakes, and if you were alive during that time and you were a little boy, these were very addictive toys, just in the same way that computer games are to the current generation. And I have to wonder if he was really playing his Nintendo 64 late at night. He couldn't stop playing, wanted to go up another level. And the other thing that is interesting about the Nintendo 64, it's a sort of toy other kids might want to play as well. They might be leaning over his shoulder and looking at what he's doing and saying, my turn, and let's see if we can get a higher score. And then that also raises the possibility, didn't JonBenet want to have a go on Burke's Nintendo 64 as well? And when Burke visited his best pal Doug Stein, didn't he show him his toy? Did he take the Nintendo 64 to the Whites? Because think about it, when he went to Fleet White the next morning, he had no problem taking the Nintendo 64 with him. Well, did he take the Nintendo 64 with him the night before? And so didn't he show Doug Stein his toy? And didn't they play a game together? Or didn't the one watch the other playing a game? Now, you might think, well, this is quite silly and this is quite unnecessary to even go into. But if we go to Perfect Murder, Perfect Town by Lawrence Schiller, we find out from someone called Megan that she really liked Burke, and what she knew about Burke as a little boy was that he was really into computer games. And so if you snort or scoff at the silliness of these details, it turns out Burke's older brother, John Andrew, was doing precisely this thing that we're suggesting here, playing computer games with a friend late at night on the very night JonBenet was murdered. And so if John Andrew was doing this, why not Burke? You want a reference for that? Well, let's go back to Perfect Murder, Perfect Town by Lawrence Schiller. At about 8:30 p.m., this is on Christmas night, December 25th, 1996, 8:30 p.m., John Andrew Ramsey went to his friend Brad Millard's home in Marietta, Georgia, to play video games. Number 5. Burke was awake later that night and earlier that morning than previously thought. To be explicit about what we're talking about here, Burke was awake later that night than the police had appreciated, but also he was awake earlier that morning than previously thought as well. Now, largely due to consistent storytelling from John and Patsy about their son Burke, Burke has receded in the Ramsey story to almost a non-entity. He was asleep. He saw and heard nothing. He didn't see the ransom note. He didn't see anything. Case closed. except when questioned more carefully, it turns out Burke wasn't asleep, just as it seemed JonBenet wasn't asleep. And that brings us to the final point in this analysis, number 6, Burke pretended to be asleep. And I think that is really, really, really interesting. So clearly the voices on the 911 call suggested that Burke was not only not asleep, but awake. Not only awake, but ambulant, and not only ambulant, but perhaps even present nearby when Patsy called 911. And if so, no wonder she hung up prematurely. Now, something that I also think is interesting, and I'm not going to play the quote, but Dr. Phil asks Burke whether he could hear Patsy calling 911 from his bedroom. Now, you know where his bedroom is, and you know where the kitchen is. I don't know about you, but I would find that quite difficult to do. And so you kind of have two areas in the Ramsey story that are now kind of unraveling. The one is that JonBenet was asleep the whole time. We don't need to talk about anything else regarding what JonBenet was doing. But then it turns out that they find evidence of pineapple in her stomach. So perhaps she wasn't asleep. And now how do we explain that, right? And then with Burke, you kind of have a situation where Burke was asleep the whole time, but then a recording emerges of his voice, and now it's like, oh, well, were you asleep all along? Well, maybe he wasn't, no big deal. But again, you have evidence that is contradicting an original story that is very simple and easy. Well, he was asleep. JonBenet was also asleep. And now everything is suddenly starting to get a little bit more complicated, a little bit more murky. And if you think about it, if the voices on the 911 call are suggesting that Burke is not only not asleep, but perhaps standing around nearby. Think about it. If Patsy calls 911 and Burke is standing there, isn't that perhaps the reason why she hung up prematurely? Maybe Burke is getting agitated. Maybe Burke is getting worried. Maybe Burke is thinking, what are you talking about, a kidnap and a ransom note? It's just something to consider. Now let's go back to Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. Maybe his mother had come into his room, but he was sure he stayed in his bed and pretended to be asleep. Even when his dad came in, he said he pretended to be asleep. He was concerned while he pretended, he said. This is what he said to Schiller. Burke told Schiller that he was awake when his mother made the phone call. His parents might have thought he was asleep, but he wasn't, he said. Now, what I think is really interesting about this idea of pretending is, couldn't he have been told, go to your room and, I don't know, was he told to pretend to be asleep? Or did he decide of his own volition to pretend to be asleep? Now, why would he do that? Had he ever done that before? And so it was in this area that the cops wondered if Burke had been coached. Also, if you think about it, it made no sense if Burke didn't know what happened to his sister, that he would lie in bed and pretend to be asleep. You know, when they were about to go on this trip, and probably a trip that he would want to go on. Think about it, there's pandemonium breaking out inside the house. And so if you think about it, doesn't it make more sense if the Ramseys knew more than they were letting on, right? If they told Burke to go to his room and pretend to be asleep. Because think about it, if you're in a situation where you appear to be asleep, maybe someone is not going to bother you and ask questions. Whereas if you're standing downstairs, isn't someone going to draw you nearer and say, hey, can you talk to us? What do you know? What did you see? Right? And instead, Burke is kind of out the way, under the radar, simply not seen. And then the next thing is sequestrated from the house. And as that happens, as Officer French tries to intervene and say, hey, can you maybe tell us something? John sort of firmly says he doesn't know anything, he was asleep. And so then Burke leaves the residence. So if he was coached then and shielded from the cops then, I'm talking about on the night and the next morning, right? If he was coached then and shielded then, why not subsequently? And why not for this June 1998 interview? And that is why, again, this question of, is Burke an important witness, becomes so pertinent. In the next analysis, we'll deal with what the cops decided regarding Burke's credibility during this interview. In a way, we've tried to think about that. We've tried to decide for ourselves, is Burke believable? Is his testimony important? Does it take us in any kind of direction? Now we want to look at what the cops thought regarding his credibility, and we'll deal with that in the next analysis. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.